everyone, I'm Captain Logan, and today I'm going to tell you how I felt about El Camino, the Breaking Bad movie. I went and saw this in the theater at the Alamo Drafthouse here in Kansas City, which was a really cool experience, and one of the reasons that I'm not getting to how I felt about it until right now. Of course, this dropped on Netflix on Friday, and it was kind of surreal having a movie that was on Netflix that I could have watched anytime I wanted to, but waited until Saturday. I was supposed to actually go yesterday, and ended up going really late Saturday night, and I'm glad that I didn't have to wait any longer than I did, because I was really worried about spoilers, and I had a couple of minor things spoiled for me, but luckily nothing major, so that was nice. It's not, I don't think, still currently playing in the theater. It was a real limited release. Around here, it was only Alamo Drafthouse that got it, and it was for those 3 days on the weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what that movie was like in the theater and whether or not I think it should have been a wide release and was theatrical worthy. And I would say that it's as theatrical worthy as Breaking Bad ever has been. I mean, it's a really cinematic kind of show, so I think making that show exactly the way it was, and it to me feels like a two-part episode of that show. It's theatrical worthy in the sense that that show always was. I mean, I think everything in that show and Better Call Saul 2 would look just fine in a movie theater, but I think it was smart to do it this way, to not be a wide release thing. I kind of wish that it had come out in the theater before it dropped on Netflix, just because I think it would have incentivized more people to go see it that way, and it would have felt like more of an event, because even if you saw it on Friday, it was available all day, so people would have seen it before you went to the theater and saw it. So that was a little bit of a bummer, just it not being early, but I think it was smart not to go wide release with it. I was a little surprised that Vince Gilligan and Netflix and AMC didn't go that way. I mean, I guess for Netflix, like, what's the point of that company doing a theatrical movie? They're a streaming site. They're going to probably make more money that way. I guess, I would assume. I don't know. But it was, and of course, I don't know that Netflix would have been involved if it wasn't going to be on their service, but I digress. When this was first announced, I was like, why wouldn't you just make it a theatrical release? Because there's, of course, an audience for that, and a big audience for that. Breaking Bad is still really popular. It's still relevant because Better Call Saul is doing pretty well, and people love that show. And so, why not just go wide release with it? And then I saw it, and I'm going to describe this movie as a 2-hour epilogue. It would not have been smart to go wide release. It sounds like Breaking Bad fans are really liking it. I really liked it. I'll say right up front, I'm feeling it. I mean, this is definitely a green sign flip. But it might have been a little bit disappointing as a big wide release to see a thing that, like I said, kind of feels like just a big epilogue. In a way, I could have seen this script being the actual finale of this show, and that's both to its credit and a little bit to its detriment. I don't know what else you would have done with this, but it feels like a big epilogue 5 years later. This is not the story of, and minor spoilers for this video, this is not the story of what Jesse Pinkman is doing 5 years later or 10 years later. This movie takes place immediately after the last episode of the series, which is, again, a little bit surreal, and was kind of fun. I walked into the theater, and Jesse Pinkman is in his car from the very end of the last episode, where he's finally getting away from the neo-Nazis, and he's screaming, and he's so happy to get away, but of course he's also really tortured, and what in the world am I going to do now? And we just leave him there. And I always liked leaving him there, but I also always wanted to know what would happen to him after that. And we get here what he does immediately after, but that's about it. It is the next couple of days, and just Jesse trying to survive and figure out how in the world he's going to get out of Albuquerque. And he's, a wanted fugitive just like Walter White was, and so how in the world am I going to escape and not get caught? And of course he's also dealing with the PTSD of being, held captive and treated as a slave by the neo-Nazis, and it's really interesting contrasting it with where he was in like the middle of season 2. I've been going back through Breaking Bad again, and that's where I am right now, which is really interesting because an episode I watched just last night, I think like 5 or 6, is informed by a flashback scene that happens in this movie, and I don't want to give away which one it is, but there's a flashback toward the end that informs what Jesse says in that episode he would try to do if he went legitimate and got a degree that informs the choice of business degree that I think worked really well. And I'll talk about flashbacks and retroactive stuff here in a minute, because I think Vince Gilligan does a phenomenal job with that, and that's one of the things that was a defining trait of Breaking Bad, is making retroactive choices, doing retroactive scenes that don't feel retroactive, where he doesn't exactly know where he's going, but he's so smart in his storytelling that he's able to kind of dupe us into thinking that he had a plan all along. And I think the man was always writing toward an ending. I think he's smart about that, but he doesn't have it all graphed out, all outlined and figured out. And I was always really impressed with just that sense of continuity and that and the care he had for that. But I was comparing it to where he's at in that episode where he gets kicked out by his parents, and where he had his house that his aunt owned that he lived in, and then they kick him out and don't let him live there anymore because they find his meth lab in the basement, and he spends that entire episode figuring out how he's going to survive and basically being homeless. And this is that again, but obviously dialed up to 11 because now he's a fugitive and everybody knows who he is. And even in that episode in season 2, he's worried about his reputation because now the DEA has him on their radar, but they don't know everything, and they don't know about his relationship with Heisenberg and all of that, and now they do, and everybody's after him. And so it's really interesting contrasting those things because of the ways in which Jesse has really grown as a person, and how, like, it's really sad. Like, in a way, Breaking Bad for him is like a really tragic coming-of-age story, where he's gained all of these skills, and he has such a better sense of the reality of the world and how things work, and he's more confident, he's more sure of himself, he's able to navigate tumultuous waters better, but he also has no chance at a normal future. And he's also really traumatized, especially by what happened to him again with the neo-Nazis and with what happened with his girlfriend and all of that. So, he continues to be a really sad and tragic character, but he's not Walter White. And of course, it's also interesting contrasting those two characters, and this seems to be all about looking at the similarities and differences between how each of them handle their fugitive status, and also how the universe chooses to reward and or punish them for the things that they've done. And it's, like I said, it's basically a 2-hour epilogue. I should backtrack for a second and say, obviously, it would be weird to watch this without knowing the show. You'd probably not really have a sense of what you're looking at. And I don't know that anybody would even think to do that. But I also think that it would be odd watching this immediately after binge-watching the show. Like, if you've never seen Breaking Bad, and you want to watch that whole show, and then immediately watch this, I don't know, I'd give it a couple weeks or a month maybe, because some of the novelty of this is we've not seen these characters in 5 years, and I did think it was kind of novel and kind of fun to come back to them like immediately after we last saw them, but it's been so long since I've seen them, and I think some of the surprises, and I won't spoil any of them, of characters that we might not expect to see again, both in flashbacks and in present day, are, I think, kind of more fun and more exciting if you took a lot of time off from it. This is for an audience that's waited a long time. So, I mean, it feels, in a way, it's sort of like a 5-year cliffhanger, where it's like, oh no, what's going to happen to Jesse? Except we didn't know we would ever get that. When Better Call Saul was announced, I was a little disappointed, because I thought if you're going to do more stuff in the Breaking Bad universe, I would want to see what happens to Jesse Pinkman, and do that show. And now that I've seen this, I actually don't know if there would have been a show there. I think Gilligan does the very best he can with this material and making a film out of it. I don't think there would have been a series there. I don't know really what you would have done with that. If anybody could figure that out, of course, it would be Gilligan, because he is a master storyteller. There are, of course, lots and lots of references to the show, but this is not Breaking Bad's greatest hits. This is not like a J.J. Abrams movie that goes back to a thing you like and just like hangs really hard on the nostalgia of it. Of course, that part of the novelty, again, is getting to see some of these characters again, but it's always in service of the story. And Gilligan, I don't want to say cheats, but I mean, he uses flashbacks as an excuse to bring in characters that you shouldn't be able to see again, or that you wouldn't expect that you would. Some of them are dead, I will say that, and some of them are just characters that it would be impossible to get in there immediately after what happens in the finale. But it's not everybody, and it's not all the big, huge, major characters. There's not for instance, Gus Fring flashback. They didn't feel the need to do this with everybody. And again, when we do it, it feels like it's in service of the story, and it's either giving us information we need about Jesse's motivations and decisions in how he's going about his strategy in trying to get out of Albuquerque. And I really appreciate how, like I said, how much he's learned and how tactical he is now, and like he's believably smart. Like, he's not a super genius, but Breaking Bad was a show that was all about change, and we see the both the negative and positive ways that Jesse Pinkman has changed, and he's able to do a lot of stuff in this movie that he couldn't have in season 1 or 2. And one important thing to note is that he's not panicking. Until he seems to run out of options, and then he gets closer to panicking. But early on, he develops a plan very quickly, and this was a guy that was always pretty street smart, and always had, if he would just apply himself, like Walter White always said, where what gets in his way is emotional insecurity, and not being sure that he's ever going to make anything of himself. This is a guy that could have done anything he wanted to if only he had not gone down the wrong path, like Walter White did, and somewhat because of Walter White. I should also mention that I like the way that Jesse is both a tragic figure and a victim. Just like in the series, I never feel like I'm supposed to just, be, cry for this guy, be misty-eyed for this guy, and every mistake that he makes, everything that happens to him is not his fault. Like, this is not a character for whom all these bad things happen to him. He makes choices that get him there, but again, there's a distinct difference between him and Walter White, where he remains the natural pacifist. He doesn't always make pacifistic decisions. He will do violent things when he has to for the sake primarily of just self-defense, whereas Walter has a complete and justifies means thing, and ultimately, even though maybe he would like to not have to murder people, he's always willing to do that, from almost minute one. And, I will say, at the beginning of the show, it takes him a while to get over that hump, but not as long as you might have expected it to. He gets used to the violence very quickly, and Jesse never does, which is what makes him a more sympathetic character, and part of why you needed him in that show. And so he's willing to kill people for self-defense and to do violence for self-defense, but he always sympathizes with people. So I'm always sympathetic toward him, and he always is sympathetic to other human beings. And so it's interesting how this movie also is, to a small degree, kind of a revenge thriller also. There is that element to it, but really only with Jesse and one other character. Primarily, Jesse is still the victim and the tragic anti-hero all at the same time. So you feel bad about all the horrible things that happened to him, especially in that last season, and some of that, of course, is not his fault. Nobody deserves what happened to him. But if he had made the choices that he did, he never would have wound up in that place. And so contrasting what happens to Walter at the end of the show and what happens to Jesse at the end of this is really interesting, because the universe, I'll just say, is going to cut Jesse a little bit more slack, as you would expect it to. And so, like I said, I like the way the series leaves him, but I also like getting to see the next couple of days after. It is I'm calling it a 2-hour epilogue. It's a really good epilogue, but that is what it is. One of the things that can be distracting, and this is nobody's fault unless you expect Netflix to shell out the money for the CG enhancements to make people look younger that you get in a lot of Marvel movies now. Everybody's 5 years older, and playing characters that are again supposed to be exactly as we saw them last. And for certain characters, it's hardly noticeable. For especially the youngest characters, a lot of them just haven't aged too much in 5 years, and you totally buy it. And then there are some of the oldest characters, you can't see it as well. But there's one character in particular who put on some weight, and it's a little bit distracting. But the writing is so good that ultimately I don't care, and I adjust to it very quickly, and there's no other way really to make this movie, so I'm not going to begrudge it that. But it is a thing that it takes you out just a little bit. I enjoyed this immensely. It is definitely to the quality that Breaking Bad always has been, and it was really cool to get to see Vince Gilligan just go back and make one more episode of that show, and without having to be really super gimmicky about getting in characters that you really want to see. And also, he just has such a good sense of the continuity of this universe, and there's nothing that seemed to directly contradict anything. There wasn't anything that felt real sequel or prequelitis to me. I say that because of Flashbacks. So again, there are retroactive scenes that are fleshing out characters, adding new bits of I was going to say mythology, I guess kind of, because there's a character or two that are added where when Jesse sees them in present day, I'm like, who is that? Like, he's acting like he's seen them before. And then we'll get a flashback that tells us who they are. And this show has always done that kind of nonlinear storytelling, so that didn't really take me out. I mean, I guess for just a second, because I wondered if I was supposed to know them, but then very quickly we get their flashback, and I go, okay. And also I buy that this happened and that it wasn't relevant until now. So it didn't. So those scenes never felt like things where I really like you would have put them in the show already if only you had thought of them. And so now it's distractive and it's cumbersome. It's not like that at all. And there's never a place that's like that, I don't think. And it's just impressive to me that he's still able to do that all these years later, with that kind of nonlinear storytelling. And it's also the only way to tell the story, because if it was all just the present day stuff, it's an hour episode. If you didn't have any of that, this could have been an episode length, but all of the flashback stuff works thematically really well. We're continuing to explore Jesse's pacifistic tendencies. We're exploring the PTSD thing. We're fleshing out. I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say that that Todd is in this. I'll just go ahead and mention that, because that's a character that continues to be even creepier than he was before, which I wouldn't have thought was possible. But there's a wonderful flashback sequence with him that I guess that kind of wins its way through part of the movie. He's in this quite a bit, actually, and we get more of that really weird disconnect with him, where he is weirdly sentimental and seems like kind of a softie, but at the same time is completely cold and unemotional when it comes to ends justifies the means, doing violence to get a job done, and ultimately doesn't actually care about what happens to anybody that gets in his way, because he was taught to do that to be that way by his uncle. And he's just this really cold, unemotional, like horrifying monster of a character who has all these really weird, like, amusing and kind of cute quirks about him. He continues to be absolutely fascinating. I should also mention there's a lot of comedy in this movie, and Breaking Bad had that, certainly, where you're surprised that you're laughing, and sometimes you're laughing at things that you feel like shouldn't be funny, and you're like, what does that say about me as a person? There's particularly a scene with a dead body in this that I found myself doing that with. But I think the movie has that as much or more than any episode of the TV show, and I don't think it ever goes too far. There's a conversation early on with Skinny Pete and Badger that I think maybe goes on a little bit too long, that's reminiscent of the Star Trek conversation, and there's a Star Trek reference with them that's fun, toward the end of the series, maybe even in the last episode, second to last episode, I think. That maybe goes on a little bit too long, but Gilligan doesn't lose sight of who these characters are and who they were the last time we saw them. And of course I should mention that he's been making Better Call Saul this whole time, and he's been using that to fill in a lot of gaps in background and to really develop the Santa Monica family and stuff like that. And so he's remained in this world this whole time, even if you haven't been watching that show. And so he's never lost sense of that continuity, but I get the sense that he loved what he was doing so much that he could have made this movie without doing Better Call Saul, and probably still wouldn't have made a lot of continuity gaps. Speaking of Better Call Saul, I kind of wondered if I would go into this movie and there would be very many references to that, or if that would inform it very much. I didn't notice anything major. There may be a reference or two that when I go, because I've only been through the first 3 seasons of Better Call Saul and only once, and maybe when I rewatch, and it's a wonderful show, so I mean, I'll rewatch it, but maybe when I rewatch it and come back to this movie, I'll find a couple of references, like small things that I didn't notice before. There are places in this movie where there are like little kind of references to things where you'll see like an unrelated sign or something that calls to something from the series. Like there's, I don't think this is a horrible spoiler, there's a Holly Street. I'm sure that's supposed to be a direct reference to Walter White's daughter, but there are also a lot of just direct continuity things that you wouldn't appreciate as much if you didn't watch the show. But I don't think Better Call Saul is really necessary at all to watch this movie. So I'm not doing a full spoiler cast on this, mostly because I'm by myself, but I wanted to mention that I'm a little bit unsure about the ending, and I kind of want to give it a second go. I don't know, I'm not going to file this in the complaint category yet, because I'm not sure if I'm right about it, but where we're left with Jesse Pinkman at the end of the film, I'm a little unsure if I totally buy that it's plausible that he gets away with it. And that's all I'll say about that. If you've seen the movie, you may know what I'm talking about. But he's in with the situation he's in, and comparing it to, again, Walter White's situation at the end of the series. I'm just not sure that he's not too high profile that he's able to do what he does. I hope that doesn't give away too much, but I'm not sure about it. But I don't really have any other complaints. It is deliberately slowly paced, just like the series is. I never get bored with it. The directing and cinematography continues to be absolutely top notch. A lot of cool song choices, just like in the show. It's got the same style and panache that the series does. It was absolutely worth seeing in the theater, and I'm so glad that it got made. I would think saying 2-hour epilogue would be a big complaint. Again, I don't think it would have probably satisfied people as much if it was a wide release movie and the only way you could see it for a while was to go to the theater. But it's really impressive that he pulled off a 2-hour epilogue 5 years after his series was over. If you can consider this a reunion movie, like a TV reunion movie, I think it's one of the best of those ever made. So anyway, those are my thoughts on El Camino, the Breaking Bad movie. I'm feeling it, certainly. And leave your comments if you saw it, and tell me what you thought of it. And in the meantime, I'm Captain Logan, and I'll see you again next time.